My name is Karen, and this is a deep structure of culture, lessons from the family. This is from a Linguistics 3600 class given at the University of Utah. We're going to start today by talking about what's called the Iceberg Model. The Iceberg Model is a visual representation. Imagine what an iceberg looks like on the water. The line here in this model represents the water surface. The things that are above the line that are primarily in our awareness or things that we can visually see around us. For culture, those things are art, literature, and food. But just like an iceberg in the water, the things that are below the surface that actually make up the bulk of the iceberg are quite a bit bigger than those that are primarily in our awareness. So those things that are out of our awareness or below the surface of the water are things like eye contact, notions of leadership, how we work, what our speed of work is, facial expressions, conceptions of beauty, definitions of sin, theory of disease, and notions of modesty. These are all things that we're going to be discussing, not just in the family, but also when we get to worldview. So those things that really make up a culture are often beneath the surface and we're unable to see them. In our textbook, on page 86, there are several questions in an orange box. I'm not going to take the time today to talk about those questions because it's one of your discussion questions, but please do take some time to explore those questions and what they mean for your family. Some of the deep structure institutions that our textbook talks about are family, state, and religion. Our textbook talks about how those three institutions help us in making our major decisions in life. Things like whether life is decided by fate or free choice, what things make up right and wrong, why there is suffering in the world, where our loyalty should be, and how to prepare for death. Many of these things we will be talking about in the worldview section. Today we'll mostly be talking about the family and how the family influences those things. The definition from our textbook of a family is a sexually expressive or parent-child or other kin relationship in which people, 1, form an economic unit and care for any young, and 2, consider their identity to be significantly attached to the group, and 3, commit to maintaining that group over time. In our textbook, it talks about two different types of family, the nuclear family and the extended family. In cultures where a nuclear family is the primary family, that includes things like parents and children and siblings inside of that group. In other cultures, usually collectivist cultures, we have an extended family structure where aunts, uncles, cousins are all involved in decisions about the family and often share economic ties as well. Globalization affects the family when we have several factors that come together. One of those things is that when mass media is spread throughout cultures, suddenly a culture that might not participate in certain actions is now exposed to those, and children might say, hey, I want to be involved in this type of activity. So mass media can help us both for the good and for the bad in terms of spreading culture. Okay, so think about what is it that happens when a culture with well-established values is exposed to a different set of values. Are those things positive? Are those things negative? The other thing that can happen with globalization in the family is when people migrate. Okay? It both affects the people who are moving to a new location and those who are left behind. For example, if I am from a very family-oriented culture where genders have very specific roles, so the father is the provider, the mother is the caretaker, and the father migrates to a new culture so that he can make money for the family, what happens to the mother who is left behind with the children in a culture where the father usually performs certain tasks, but now the father is not there? So even though the father is still involved in the way the family works, it's not the same role for the mother now who is left behind. The other thing that can happen is in a very collectivist culture where we rely a lot on extended family, if part of our family unit moves to a new culture, then how does the family that's left behind function together? Okay. Now, There are lots of variants that happen in family interactions. Okay? Our book says that family and religion must be viewed in terms of their interactions with other institutions. That means that when we're talking about families, it's not just about family, but it sometimes interacts with the other things. Here are a couple of examples. So a Christian family that prays before a meal is teaching their children that they believe those things are important, both the meal and also thanking God for the meal. Okay? Another example from a culture is flying a flag and singing God Bless America. So here we have a little bit of integration from the state and from religion, and then we have family interactions as well. So as our families participate in certain activities within our culture, those things are transmitted from generation to generation as cultural values. There are three variants that I want to talk about right now. One is gender, one is individualism versus collectivism, which we've also talked about a little bit already, and the third one is the elderly, how we care for the elderly. Okay? Gender is primarily influenced by the family. So the family is our first interaction that establishes what we think our gender identity is. Okay, the name that our parents choose for us, what types of clothes that they buy for us, what types of clothes they let us buy as we start to get a little bit older. And in some cases, languages have gender-specific language. So maybe females or males use different forms of address. But it's not just about different forms of address. It also has to do with what type of language do we use in referring to different genders. So we might use very nice words when we describe a male's leadership. So a male who's aggressive, we use the words like leader, and he's really making a name for himself. But when we talk about females and their aggressive nature, we use more negative language to describe them. Those types of things influence the way children view gender and view themselves. Okay, here's an example. In the Latino culture, males are often thought to be the protector. They have to have courage, but they also need to be generous. Females need to be self-sacrificing, subordinating, and they suffer for their children. Okay? Compare this with the United States, where we have males who are successful, aggressive, sexual, and self-reliant. Okay? Females are supposed to be nurturing, sensitive, and interdependent, concerned with their appearance. We know that these are some of the gender roles that our society expects because we have a lot of jokes about when someone does not meet that gender role. For example, with females in United States culture, we often joke about them being slow to get ready for a date. The interdependence, we joke about girls going to the bathroom together, or that they're unable to do things on their own. Then when a male doesn't meet the expectations, he might often be called a sissy or a mama's boy or something that indicates that he is more feminine in nature. So a boy who's sensitive, we don't accept as well as a girl who is sensitive. We expect that sensitivity from girls. In fact, if girls are, even girls, if they are being too sensitive, we might say something like, oh, it's time to, man up. And so we refer to the male gender in order to describe the behavior that we want. Okay? Another way that we can look at this is if you look at sexuality, men are often praised for their sexual behavior, where women, if they perform the same behavior, if they behave the same way, like having multiple sex partners, we refer to them in a very negative way. So we seem to praise men because we expect men to be very sexual, but then we berate females because that's not supposed to be one of their characteristics in our culture. If we take a look at individualism and collectivism, we've talked about this a lot. One important thing to think of is to think about it on a continuum. So on one side we have people who are from an individualist culture, and on the other side we have people from a collectivist culture. Most people don't fall on one end or the other, but have characteristics of both and fall somewhere in the middle on the continuum. So they might be closer to a collectivist culture or closer to an individualistic culture. We'll look at this a little bit more for culture-specific examples when we get to chapter 6. So if we look at individualism in the family, as we look at the United States, okay, early travelers to the United States would often brag about their children and how wild and unruly they were. If you think about the way the United States was colonized, often people who came to the United States were self-selective individuals already. So they, in order to feel brave enough to come to a new place, those were often people who were very individualistic already. So you have a number of people who come together who are already possessing a lot of individualistic traits, and then they continue to admire those in their children, which causes the culture growing up to then to value individualism. Okay? The child is encouraged to leave the nest. In fact, if a child is still living at home after age 18, we often look down on that in our culture. It seems acceptable if they're going to school or something, but by age 30, we seem to expect that children are not going to be living with their parents. In other cultures, it's very common for children to live with their parents for their whole lives, even to bring their family into the home. Okay? In United States, U.S. American culture, the child has privacy and their own room. And they're also highly encouraged to develop their own opinion and solve their own problems. So parents might say something to a child when a child comes to the parent with a question. Parents might say something like, well, what do you think we should do about that? Or what do you want to do about that? How do you think we could solve that problem? So we often reflect back to the child to let the child work it out. Also, when children get into a fight at school or something, parents may say things like, well, we should let them solve their own problems. And so instead of getting involved, we might choose to stay out of it in this culture. That's a high example of individualism. Let's take a look at what collectivism looks like. Okay? Collectivism, often the extended family relies on one another for support and childcare. Okay, I have one example of a person who I knew who was working for me, and when she was going to have a baby, I wondered, well, what's going to happen when she has this baby? Is she going to stay here and work or not? And she said no. Her role in the family was to be one of the money makers. So she was expected to economically help support the family. And she had 3 other children. Her family members cared for those children while she went off to work. So a sister of hers actually cared for the children. So different members of the family had different responsibilities. Some of the women were expected to care for the children and raise the children, and some of the women were expected to go off to work with the men to help provide for the children. So she didn't just bring home money to take care of her own children and husband and family inside of her own house. She also brought home money to economically support the extended family as well. So together they worked as one unit in terms of how they made their money. Okay, we also cultures that have collectivism as a high value, they place high value on loyalty and cooperation. So instead of encouraging children to rise above and maybe be the best at something, they're trying to encourage the culture to work together so that the whole culture can rise together. Okay? Often we see things like godparents and a view that the nuclear family is incomplete. So if myself, my husband, and my children are together, that's not really a complete family. I would also need to have my grandparents and maybe some of my brothers and sisters as well. Okay? In a collectivist family, we often share work, income, and expenses as a single unit. So we don't make decisions based on what is good for one person. We make decisions based on what is good for the whole family as a unit. And we're often looking at a larger unit than in an individualistic family. In a collectivist family, it's important that each individual put the needs of the family before personal interests. International students may recognize this as we have talked about choosing majors for degrees. In an individualistic culture, it's very common for children to be encouraged to choose whatever they want, whatever will make them happy. In a collectivist culture, children are expected to get certain jobs because they're expected to provide certain things for the family. So it might be their turn to provide for the grandparents and for the rest of the family. So they can't get just any job. They have to study specific fields in order to gain certain jobs that will make them successful and able to provide for the whole family. We also see a lifelong obligation to parents. In an individualistic culture, when the child leaves the parents assume that the child is going to be responsible for himself or herself, but the parents are also responsible on their own, where children are responsible for themselves and not worried about helping pay for things for parents. In a collectivist culture, we see the reverse. We see that parents have a longer responsibility to their children, and then in turn, children have a lifelong obligation to their parents. Sometimes that's financially, sometimes that's in terms of the care, and they also have a high desire to please their parents. If we look at the elderly and how cultures view the elderly, there are two different main things that can happen. One is we have a negative perception of growing old. The second is a positive perception of growing old. We can see in cultures that have a negative perception of growing old, we see things like they do all they can to stay young. So we have a lot of plastic surgery. They might have certain drinks or health concoctions that they use to try to keep their youthful appearance. It doesn't seem like it's acceptable to grow old. We might dye our hair so that we don't have gray hairs because we don't want to look old. We're very happy to look young. Okay? Often the elderly in this type of a culture will be isolated from the rest of culture and society. So in the United States, we see a lot of retirement homes or rest homes where elderly people are kind of placed there by their families, not to be a burden to their family and to be on their own, but to receive some care. And so we see that we sort of place them away from the rest of culture and society. The opposite perspective is a positive perception of growing old, where it's embraced to grow old. Often special authority is given to the elderly, so we know that people who are older have kind of a life force that we respect and we revere, and so we look to them for advice to help us with our lives. Okay? We have a responsibility as younger people to respect and care for the elderly. We might even have some sort of an homage to our ancestors in our home in a culture like this. We're encouraged to listen to our elders. And we think they have some sort of special abilities in order to be able to live for so long. This chapter also has a small section about aggression, and it doesn't necessarily fit exactly with the family, but I want to talk about how this is viewed in cultures and how families might encourage or discourage aggression. Okay? If we value aggression as one of our cultural values, then things that happen in our family might be said like this. In order to approve and reward that, so we want our children to have strong personalities and the ability to take care of themselves, we might say things like, oh, just stand up for yourself. Don't let them kick you around like that. Just stand up for yourself. Or fight back. Don't be a sissy. So again, this idea that a certain type of behavior is more desired than another. In a collectivist culture, we often discourage aggression, and we say things like, oh, well, consider, how would that other person feel? Or we encourage humility, politeness, and respect to earn friends. So it seems like an aggressive type culture is looking for the person to, by themselves, establish a leadership role. In a non-aggressive culture, we look for people to establish a good position in society by being polite to others and inspiring the better of the group. So again, thinking about what it is that would help others do better.